The church smelled of damp wood and wilted lilies, a heavy perfume that clung to the air like a shroud. It was October 12th, a gray Thursday afternoon, and the pews creaked under the weight of mourners' neighbors, teachers, distant cousins all gathered in the dim light of St. Augustine's chapel. At the front, a simple oak casket rested beneath a flickering spotlight, surrounded by chrysanthemums that drooped as if they, too, were grieving. 9-year-old Lila Harper stood beside it, her small frame swallowed by a navy dress her father had ironed the night before. Her hands gripped a folded piece of graph paper, its edges frayed from nervous fingers. Her chestnut hair hung in 2 loose ponytails, tied with faded yellow ribbons, her mother's favorite. It was the last thing Abigail Harper had asked for, her voice a rasp in the sterile hospital room. "Were your ponytails, Lila? Let me see my girl one more time." Lila had promised, tears streaking her face, and now she stood trembling, fulfilling that vow. The room was a sea of hushed breaths and stifled sobs. Among the crowd sat Marjorie Tate, president of the Pine Hollow Homeowners Association, a woman in her late 40s with a severe blonde bob and eyes like chipped flint. She wore a navy blazer over a cream blouse, her posture rigid as a flagpole, a leather satchel clutched in her lap. Marjorie wasn't there to mourn. She was there to observe. Her lips pursed as she scanned the room, her gaze lingering on Lila's ponytails with a flicker of disdain. To her, they were an infraction, too casual, too childish for a public community event, as outlined in Section 6C of the HOA bylaws. She leaned toward her VYC chair, a nervous man named Harold, and muttered something under her breath. Harold's eyes widened, but he shook his head, whispering back. Marjorie's expression didn't soften, it hardened. Lila stepped to the microphone, her sneakers scuffing the stone floor. The room stilled as she unfolded her paper, her voice a fragile thread. "My mom was my whole world," she began, then faltered, her throat tightening. She blinked rapidly, fighting tears, and continued. "She taught me how to ride a bike and made the best pancakes." Her words dissolved into a whisper. "I miss her." She stepped back, turning toward the casket, her shoulders shaking as the crowd murmured soft sympathies. And then Marjorie stood. Her heels clicked like gunfire on the stone, each step deliberate, unyielding. She reached into her satchel and pulled out not a tissue, not a condolence card, but a pair of cordless hair clippers. The low buzz cut through the silence like a chainsaw in a library. "Excuse me," she said, her voice crisp and officious. Per Pine Hollow HOA regulations, all attendees at community-sanctioned events must adhere to grooming standards. Those ponytails violate the code. The room froze. A woman in the third row gasped, "What are you doing?" A man near the back muttered, "This is insane." But Marjorie didn't waver. She approached Lila, who stood rooted by the casket, her wide hazel eyes darting between the woman and the buzzing machine. "It's not personal, dear," Marjorie said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "Rules are rules." Before anyone could react, before the pastor could step down from the pulpit, before a single mourner could cross the aisle, Marjorie seized Lila's shoulder with one hand and pressed the clippers to her head with the other. A thick strand of chestnut hair fell to the floor, curling like a dead leaf. Lila didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just stood there, her body rigid, her breath shallow, as the clippers carved a jagged path across her scalp. Screams erupted from the pews, "Stop her! She's a child!" But it was too late. By the time a burly uncle yanked Marjorie back, the damage was done. A cruel, uneven gash marred Lila's head, her ponytails reduced to clumps on the stone. Silence crashed over the church, thick and suffocating. Marjorie stepped back, brushing her hands as if she'd just pruned a shrub. "It's just hair," she said, tucking the clippers into her bag. "The bylaws are clear." She turned to leave, her heels echoing in the stunned hush. Oblivious to the horror she'd left behind. Lila's father, Daniel Harper, rose from the front pew. A public defender with a reputation for quiet tenacity, he was a man who'd faced down hardened criminals without flinching. But now, His face was a mask blank, unreadable, the kind of stillness that precedes a hurricane. He dropped to his knees beside Lila, his hands trembling as he pulled her into his arms. She didn't hug him back. She just stared at the casket, her lips parted, her breathing a faint wheeze. Tufts of her hair clung to her dress like ash. Marjorie paused at the door, glancing back with a faint smirk. "You're all overreacting," she said. "It's a community standard, not a crime." Then she was gone, Leah VYing the church in chaos, mourners shouting, a woman dialing 911, the pastor clutching his rosary like a lifeline. But Daniel didn't move. He held Lila, his mind reeling, unable to process the violation he'd just witnessed. This wasn't justice. This wasn't order. This was something monstrous. The next morning, Daniel didn't go to his office. He didn't answer the calls from his paralegal or the texts from his sister. He sat in his study, the blinds shut, the air stale with coffee and grief. Papers littered his desk: HOA bylaws, meeting minutes, a grainy video of the funeral someone had uploaded online. He played it on loop, the sound muted, watching Marjorie's calm brutality over and over. Each time, his fists clenched tighter, his knuckles whitening. Lila hadn't spoken since the church. She hadn't eaten the toast he'd left by her door, hadn't turned off her bedside lamp. When he'd knocked that morning, she'd whispered through the crack, "Can you fix my hair, Dad?" His heart had shattered. There was nothing left to fix. That night, he didn't sleep. He paced the house, barefoot on the cold hardwood, flipping through the HOA manual with a highlighter in hand. Marjorie's defense was predictable: policy, procedure, the sanctity of rules. But Daniel saw through it: cruelty cloaked as duty, power wielded without mercy. By dawn, he'd made a decision. He didn't shave, didn't change out his rumpled shirt. He grabbed a manila folder, stuffed it with notes, and drove to the county courthouse. At 8:45 a.m., he stormed into the office of Assistant DA Carla Ruiz, a friend from law school who'd once called him the most stubborn bastard in the state. She looked up from her coffee, startled. "Dan, what the hell?" "I'm taking this," he said, dropping the folder on her desk. Marjorie Tate, Pine Hollow HOA. What she did to Lila. Carla frowned, flipping through the page's witness statements, bylaws, a still from the video showing Lila's hollow stare. "I heard about the funeral. It's awful, but are you sure you want to prosecute this yourself? You're too close." "I'm not asking," Daniel cut in, his voice low and steel-edged. "Battery on a minor. Emotional distress. Abuse of authority. This isn't an HOA dispute. It's a crime." He pulled a warrant draft from his jacket, signed it with a flourish, and slid it across the desk. "Let's move." Marjorie Tate didn't flinch when the subpoena arrived. She stood in her pristine kitchen, sipping chamomile tea in a silk robe, and laughed a sharp, barking sound that echoed off the granite counters. "They're suing me," she said in her phone, pacing past a framed HOA President of the Year plaque. "For enforcing the rules? Ridiculous." She called her friend Linda, the HOA treasurer, and read the charges aloud, snickering between lines. "Battery? On a child? It's hair, Linda. It grows back." By midday, her amusement faded. The doorbell rang, and a sheriff's deputy handed her a court summons. She called 911, her voice shrill. "I'm being harassed by the DA's office. This is personal." The dispatcher's response was dry. "Ma'am, get a lawyer." She did. Victor Grayson, the HOA's attorney, was a wiry man with a penchant for winning petty disputes fines over unmowed lawns, citations for unapproved paint colors. Marjorie stormed into his office the next morning, armed with a binder of bylaws and a rehearsed tirade. "I followed protocol," she snapped. "The cemetery's in Pine Hollow. It's a community event. Those ponytails were a violation section 6C, paragraph 2. Victor didn't smile. He slid a file across the desk. "This isn't CIVYL, Marjorie. It's criminal. Battery. Distress. Abuse of power under administrative pretense. Harper's coming for you." Her bravado cracked. "I was upholding standards," she muttered, but her voice wavered. Victor shook his head. "They've got video. Witnesses. You shaved a kid's head at her mother's funeral. No jury's buying standards as a defense. Daniel didn't stop at charges. He dug deeper, unearthing a trail of Marjorie's reign over Pine Hollow. Fines issued without notice due law $200 for a cracked birdhouse, due law $150 for a non-compliant mailbox. Complaints from residents bullied into silence. A widow harassed over her rose bushes, a veteran cited for flying a flag too high. Then there were the emails, hundreds of them, signed by Marjorie, dripping with condescension. Your child's tricycle obstructs the sidewalk. Remove it or face legal action. Your Halloween decorations violate aesthetic guidelines. Comply by 5 p.m. She'd ruled like a dictator, her clipboard a scepter, her bylaws a guillotine. The case gained traction. Former residents came forward. A single mom who'd moved after Marjorie reported her son's skateboard noise to CPS. An elderly couple fined for a cluttered porch swing. Each story fueled Daniel's resolve. This wasn't just about Lila. It was about a woman who'd turned a neighborhood into a prison. Marjorie clung to her throne. At the next HOA meeting, she sat at the head of the table, gavel in hand, daring the room to challenge her. But the air had shifted. Members avoided her gaze, their whispers sharp with unease. The VY had spread online. On local news, Marjorie Tate, the HOA tyrant, Shah VY-ing a grieve VY in girl's head. She banged the gavel, called the meeting to order, but no one listened. The room was a ticking bomb, and she was the fuse. The trial began on a frigid November morning. Marjorie strode into the courtroom like a general, her suit pressed, her pearls gleaming. She smirked at the charges, whispered to Victor, rolled her eyes as the clerk read, battery of a minor. When Daniel stood to speak, she snorted loud enough for the gallery to hear. They're ruining me over ponytails, she hissed. Judge Evelyn Carter, a no-nonsense veteran with a gavel like a thunderclap, called for order. Daniel didn't grandstand. He stood still, his voice steady as he addressed the jury. This isn't about hair. It's about a woman who used power to harm a child. He nodded to the bailiff. Roll the tape. The screen flickered to life. The funeral unfolded in grainy color. Lila's trembling voice, Marjorie's cold march, the buzz of the clippers. The courtroom held its breath as the blade met Lila's scalp, her hair falling in slow, silent clumps. A juror covered her mouth. Another looked away. Marjorie's smirk vanished, her face paling as the reality of her actions played out in stark clarity. Daniel turned to the jury. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a rule enforced. This was cruelty, plain and simple. And today, we hold her accountable. He sat, his words lingering like smoke. Marjorie exploded. She grabbed the defense table's microphone, her voice a jagged shriek. That girl was defiant. It's just hair, it grows back. I'm the VY Tim here, persecuted for doing my job. Judge Carter's gavel slammed down. Sit down, MS. Tate. But the damage was done. The jury's faces hardened, their verdict already forming. 7 charges. 7 guilty verdicts. Marjorie stood frozen as Judge Carter delivered the sentence. 3 years probation, 200 hours of community care VYC, mandatory counseling, and a public apology to Lila Harper at the church, on the same stone floor where it happened. Marjorie's lips moved, but no sound came. For once, she was speechless. 2 weeks later, St. Augustine stood quiet under a slate-gray sky. No mourners filled the pews, no flowers lined the altar. Just Daniel, Lila, and Marjorie beneath the arched doorway. Marjorie clutched a crumpled paper, her hands shaking, her once perfect hair lank and unstyled. She wore a faded sweater, her eyes sunken, her defiance stripped bare. She stepped to the podium, her voice a rasp. I apologize to Lila Harper. What I did was wrong. It was cruel. I hurt you when you were already suffering, and I can't undo that. Her fingers dug into the paper, her knuckles white. I let rules blind me. I forgot what it means to be human. I'm sorry. She looked up, expecting tears, anger, something. But Lila stood, her small frame steady, and walked toward her. The room held its breath. Lila stopped at the steps, her hazel eyes locking onto Marjorie's. "You don't need to say more," she said, her voice clear, calm. "Just leave us alone." She turned, took Daniel's hand, and walked out into the cold daylight, Leah VYing Marjorie trembling, her apology unfinished. Pine Hollow changed. The HOA dissolved in a quiet vote, its bylaws shredded, its signs torn down. A new council rose, one that prized compassion over control, that let kids draw on sidewalks and gardens grow wild. Marjorie fought it, sent letters, threatened lawsuits, but no one cared. When she returned from a week away, her house was empty, her belongings boxed on the curb with a note. "Unit no longer under HOA jurisdiction. We wish you well elsewhere." She left without a word. Lila healed, piece by piece. Therapy helped solve questions about school, then grief, then trust. One crisp December morning, Daniel found her at the bathroom mirror, her hair grown back enough for two short, uneven ponytails. She tied them herself, yellow ribbons and all. He stood in the doorway, tears welling, not of pain, but of pride. She met his eyes in the reflection, a faint smile, tugging her lips the first since Abigail's death. Marjorie faded into obscurity, her name a whisper in Pine Hollow, a warning etched in memory. The neighborhood breathed again, free of her shadow, and Lila Harper, with her ponytails and quiet strength, became its heart. If you were the one in this story, how would you react? Would you stand up and fight back, or accept the unreasonable pressure and control from the HOA? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this VY Deo with more people. Your small action gives us the motivation to keep bringing you more intense and engaging stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next VY Deo.